Through the cloud you could glimpse dense undergrowth at the cliff's feet. Here in the sun, on this flowery shelf between the hills behind and the cliffs below, I could have been on a magic carpet. I was, though unaware of this, within a few hundred yards of a mysterious mildewed concrete circle, perhaps 6 feet in diameter, also near the cliff's edge. We do not know for how many years the deep vertical shaft it caps has protected cattle, sheep, and the unaware from a fatal drop, nor do we know how deep is this avenc, an old word from the French Languedoc language of Oc, meaning natural shaft, vertical cave, or abyss. But one day I will surely find out, for not a quarter of a mile away, the house named after this avenc was to come close to taking over my life. I looked up at a broad, shallow fold in the hillside across which my track would wind next, still climbing, and there, at the top of a gentle rise, with the hills behind, stood l'Avenc. I knew this was the house's name because, curiously, and unlike most of the other isolated homesteads which dot rural Catalonia, it was marked on the map. Odd. Why would a particular house be shown and named? Even from this distance, I could see that the place was derelict. Yet it had majesty. Something about the way that untypically tall, 3-story stone facade dominated the sloping meadows around, marked it out as special. Abandoned maybe, but with a kind of dignity. The shape was untypical, too. Most farmhouses in the region had the characteristic rural Catalan outline, long and quite low beneath an off-centred roof, with a longer slope to one side and a shorter one to the other. Charming as they are, they lack stature. l'Avenc's stature was what first struck you. Nobody who sees it ever forgets the massive stone arch above the doorway, fanning out wide and high, dwarfing what were really very sizable wooden doors. They were shut, but broken and rotting. There was something different about this place, something enchanted. It hit you between the eyes. There was something striking in this solitude, too. How long had the house been here? 500? 1,000 years? The view could hardly have been very different a millennium ago. There were no other dwellings around, no hikers, no fences, no roads, no sign at all of people. I thought then, and have so often thought since, that l'Avenc did not quite belong where it was, and knew that it didn't. Looking down at the clouds rolling around the valley, as you might from a jet, it was possible to imagine that l'Avenc was in the sky. This was a castle in the air, a castle in Spain. This could be my castle in Spain. It was at any rate unreachable by road. One way along the cliffs, still an hour's walk away, was my original destination, the village of Rupit, its narrow stone streets and rustic houses tucked into a wooded gorge. In the other direction, from which I'd come, half an hour's walk, stood remote Tavertet, at the dead end of a tortuous road, in whose 11th-century stone church of Saint Christoffel I was later to find an old wooden pew, carved with l'Avenc, a pew which had long been empty. And in the middle of nowhere, it seemed, stood l'Avenc in unobserved grandeur. Who had carved that stone arch around the great doorway, its curve a massive yet delicate construction? The windows at the front and side, unglazed, rotting wooden shutters hanging askew to each side, had eyebrows of intricately carved stone screenwork, and there were arrow slits beneath the eaves of the huge tiled roof. A date was chiselled on a mysterious crest above one of these windows. It looked like 1557 or 1559. The back of the house seemed much older. The workmanship breathed pride, taste, and wealth. The situation was breathtaking. Yet, though obviously once prized, this fortified stone mansion had been abandoned. Why? It intrigued me. I stood a long time, taking it all in and wondering. I'll come back here, I thought, and walked on. l'Avenc had stolen into my heart. Christmas Eve, 1997. On the brink of a tremendous decision, I hardly slept. I would doze off and within minutes be reawoken by another argument tugging at my sleeve, another argument about l'Avenc. I told myself and insisted to others that the decision facing me carried no great risk or difficulty either way, but deep down I must have known how big it was, and that if I took the leap, I would take with me my sister Belinda and her husband and family too. We would be in this together, and it would be the biggest step any of us had taken since we were young, setting a course for the rest of our lives. I wonder whether, unconsciously, we knew that. More than 20 years had passed since first I saw Levenk. Times without number we'd walked that way again, taking friends, younger sisters and brothers, and even my mother Teresa. We piggybacked her over ruts and gullies in the deteriorating track. Times without number we'd fallen again beneath the spell of the house. Everyone always did. All who saw Levenk felt awestruck, mystified at its fate, and a little bit sad. The big doors were swinging loose in the wind, the roof a little more precarious. Never had we seen anyone around the place taking care of it. Never had we seen the least sign of ownership. People locally said it was one of the finest old houses in the Col Sacabra. That Christmas Eve, as I wrestled with the decision whether to turn away from what might shape up to be a staggering task, we knew only that the place was precious and important, that it had a history, and that its rescue was urgent. But why us? Anyone in Tavatet or Rupit would have sighed that something ought to be done, yet nobody had come forward. Everybody regretted the fall of the house of Levenk, but all could see that the building's restoration would be a colossal undertaking. Tavatet was a modest village rooted in farming, but with a growing sprinkling of holiday homes. The problem with this house was its distance from proper roads and services. Restoration was beyond the ambitions of a small community, and nobody with both the mission and the means had ever come forward. The house and its land were now part of an extensive agricultural estate stretching all the way along the cliffs, whose absentee owner either couldn't or wouldn't maintain the house at its centre. Why should he? He was a farmer, not a custodian of historic buildings, and the house was of little use to his business. No modern labourer or manager would want to move in there with a family, no plumbing, telephone or electricity, all but inaccessible by road. So the owner had let it go. His cattle had invaded the ground floor of the house and were using it for shade and shelter. Cow muck was everywhere. My brothers and sisters, just children when, newly arrived in Spain, we'd first walked that way, had become almost Catalan now, all married to Catalans, all with children of their own. Belinda, a teenager then, had married a young man called Joachim, Kim, whose family ran a builder's merchant's business in the valley town of Manlleu. She'd met him as a teacher, trying to teach him English in our mother's school of languages. The attempt to teach Kim English failed, so she'd married him instead. Kim and Belinda were now as captivated by Levenk as I was. And as our interest had deepened over the years, so had our curiosity. One bright morning in the early 1980s, we'd prized open the door and entered the house. This time I was with my other sister, Deborah, who'd married a Catalan farmer and still loved exploring the wild places in the Col Sacabra with me. It was dark inside. The rotting shutters were still on their hinges, and it took a while for our eyes to accustom. What we saw then astonished us. We'd expected dereliction, of course, and we found it. The 2 wooden floors had half rotted away, and there were gaping holes in the wood-wormed oak. Intruders, hikers perhaps, taking shelter for the night, had built fires with fallen planks, and there was graffiti on the bare stone walls. But on the whole, Levenk's uninvited visitors had respected the place. When we clambered up the remains of a staircase to the first floor and picked our way around the walls where the floor was safest, we saw why. This was no farmhouse at all. It was a stately home, a small chateau. The room we were in had obviously been a stateroom, about 50 feet long and half as wide. Its ceiling was 3 times as high as any modern building would allow, giving the whole space a cool, classical symmetry. At the room's end, the front facade of the house, the double window with a stone window seat to each side, was crowned by an elaborately carved stone frame, very ornate. This, and all the other features of the room, not least its scale, lent it an air of nobility. The doorways were extraordinary. They were theatrical, like the square proscenium arches of London theatres.